How do you see young people being criminalized in schools?
I think that there are numerous ways that young people are being criminalized in schools. The best way for me to really kind of share some examples and just kind of resonate it from my own experience. And I see it too with a lot of the families that I work with, But I recall being 7 years old and in second grade, and I was placed in a program called Gifted and Talented Education. I was the only brown kid in the class, and all of my classmates were, for the most part, white and or Asian. Most of them came from households where their parents were professionals, father wore a coat and tie. A lot of the moms were these kind of stay-at-home moms involved and active in the PTA. It's very, kind of leave it to Beaverish, right? And this was right around the time of the video game era, early 80s, was just kind of popping off. And one of my classmates had a video game watch. It was like a Space Invaders watch, and kids would just line up to play this video game watch, but I'm playing kickball. Had nothing to do with the watch, but the watch was missing one day. It came up missing, and there was, for no other reason other than me being the poor brown kid in the class, I was accused of stealing the watch. And the principal of the school and someone else, I can't even recall who the other person was, I think it was probably like a yard duty teacher. They had me in there, and it was like an inquisition, man. I mean, I felt like I'm 7 years old. It felt like there was like the lights in your face, and they're like, and I kept telling them that I didn't take the watch, but they just kept saying, "We know you took it, just admit it." And then they're talking about, and they're threatening. They're talking about, well, this is stealing, and you could go to jail, and all these kinds of things. I was so scared, and I remember crying because I was so scared and just feeling frustrated. And I remember years later watching Chris Rock, one of his specials, his stand-up specials, in which he talks about the experience of driving his car and being pulled over by the police, and that the police almost convinced him he stole his own car. And that's how I felt. You almost are ready to confess just to kind of, break away from that emotional duress that they're creating. They almost begin to make you question, well, damn, did I steal the watch? I just don't remember. Was I sleepwalking? Lo and behold, the watch turned out another white kid from another grade level had it and whatnot, and they sent me off to class without an apology or anything, just kind of like, well, it's been resolved, case closed. But my spirit was wounded, and that never got healed up. And that's just an example I use to kind of resonate. In middle school, 12 years old, I'm in 7th grade, and I got into a fight. Getting into a fight in school kind of used to just kind of be a part of growing up. You got into a fight so that and there was a teaching. There was something you were supposed to learn from that experience, which is, here's a learning opportunity where adults could have brought us into the room and taught us how to use our words. Like, let's get to the root. Why did you guys fight? What was this all about? And then teach us how to use our words to transform the conflict that we had. But what ended up happening was I got into a fight, and my neighborhood, I'm 12 years old, kind of came and backed me up. His neighborhood kind of came and backed him up, so high school kids kind of got dragged into the mix. And so the police labeled it as a gang incident. Somehow they caught wind of it because of all the drama that was involved. And and the fight was over. It was already done with, end of story. But the police are interrogating us, both of us, and we're both denying even fighting. We know, there's those unwritten street scriptures. It's like, and it's done, it's resolved, right? We handled our business and move on. So the police are threatening both of us. So this issue I had with him and the issue he had with me, it was like all of a sudden I almost felt aligned to him because the police officers are physically threatening both of us. And I'd been taught I had certain constitutional rights and whatnot, and I made a remark because he's like, "Man, I'll bust you in your lip." They're making threats and this and that, and I just said, "Go ahead." Boom. Punched me right in the face. I was shocked. I looked at the vice principal, and the vice principal just looked away. So when we begin to talk about a schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline, we have to really begin to kind of think about and think comparatively almost in a social historical context, which is public education, public schools, in many ways, in its early formation, were kind of like the first juvenile detention centers. Not private school and private education, mind you. There's a fundamental difference, because in public schools, we're oftentimes being trained by bells and schedules and discipline to become obedient factory workers. We're supposed to inherit the subordinate positions of our parents in public school. There's tracking. People talk about the failure of public schools. Public schools are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing by design. So it was also about indoctrination, miseducation, in order to maintain social control. So, when we think about colonialism in this country, all we have to do is refer to the boarding school system and the impact and devastation it had on our American Indian communities. And those were the first juvenile halls. And so schools have always been a part of this sort of carceral state, for lack of a better term. It's been linked. Now, that's not to say that to be dismissive of all the transformative and empowering work that's happened in schools, but that, I need to say, hasn't been by design. That has been the exception. That has been because there have been individuals who were in those systems who cared about students, teachers, counselors, community partners. So that, I think, is part of when we talk about the Schoolhouse to Jails pipeline. In some ways, I think it's important for us to always remind ourselves and think comparatively in a social historical context about what it is that we're really trying to change, if in its roots and in its inception they were inextricably linked.
And you also talked about sort of the legacy of that system in terms of the trauma to young people and communities of color in particular, and how that legacy is playing out as well. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Certainly. Something that my organization recently did is we helped support and facilitate a youth-led, pre-action research project, and it was really kind of born in the wake of the gang injunction organizing. We didn't want to just organize around what we were saying no to, but we were saying yes to. And so it was done with my staff, who are phenomenal community leaders, who had once been labeled, and their current, I should say just current defendants in the Fruitvale gang injunction, because they haven't been removed from that list, but they've been acknowledged, recognized community leaders for their outstanding work that they've been involved in for the last few years, and our young students at Dewey Academy, many who, because of their situation at the continuation school, have also been system impacted. And we wanted to organize what we were saying yes to, and so we began by having the young people sit in circle, bringing photos, and just begin to share stories about those photos. And then we began to kind of talk and open up about experiences we've had. And we also use theater, the press. We use a number of sort of creative outlets to kind of give voice and power to the young people's stories and help them begin to kind of develop the narrative for what developed into the fotonovela. And the recurring theme that came up time and time again was that there is no space in which we allow young people just to be young people. We heard stories of them being criminalized in the context of schools, being patted down and searched and accused of things they hadn't done, or treated like criminals in school, just having to kind of assume the position. And that's become normalized in our public schools. And imagine if that was happening at Andover or Exeter, or one of these very prestigious private schools in this country that educates the children of billionaires and presidents and senators. Imagine if those kids were subject to that. Are we going to say that those kids don't experiment with recreational use of drugs or controlled substances or alcohol or whatever it is that our young person was being searched for from Jump Street? Of course they do. But it's treated fundamentally different. If a young person in Oakland is found in possession of marijuana, they get sent to jail. If a young person gets found with a controlled substance, the worst case scenario is they might get sent to some place like the Betty Ford Clinic, where they swim some laps for a couple weeks, you know what I mean? play tennis and and attend group therapy. So there's major and fundamental disparities in terms of the way they're treated. So young people are feeling criminalized in the context of schools. Oftentimes they're carrying pain and trauma to the classroom that teachers and other school administration are unaware of and aren't equipped to address. So the reality is it's not uncommon for a young person to have a loved one murdered, to have someone that they know killed here in Oakland, and then you expect them to sit still and listen to the lesson. And that's the way we start out the fotonovela. Young men coming from a weekend in which their friend has just been killed, and they're being regulated on for not paying attention by the teacher, so they get sent out. Then they get lectured by the principal, who sends them home. So then they're out on the block and they're kicking it in front of their friend's house. And these are all stories that our young people shared, is that even in front of their own homes. So there was a story of after one of our young men, after his brother was killed, they were all gathered in front of the house in their own fence line, and then got regulated on by the police. So you're not even allowed to be in front of your own home. And we've seen something more, similar most recently, like in Ferguson, where we heard reports of families who didn't even join the march, but showed solidarity from within the fence line of their own homes, held up signs saying "Justice for Michael Brown," and police shot tear gas canisters into their front yard and attacked them. So even in your own home, you're not allowed to just be. And then out in the community, there were stories and double standards. Like for us in our community, Dia de los Muertos, is rooted in indigenous tradition and spirituality as a time for us to honor our loved ones who've made their journey to the spirit world. And in our belief system, they come back and they visit us, and we honor them. And so what we've tried to do is, for a lot of our young people dealing with trauma, we help try to create that as a time for a space for healing, to honor particularly some of those who we've lost to violence in the community. So some of our young people have been hemmed up even in their efforts and their attempt to honor loved ones during Dia de los Muertos, jammed up by the police in their own community, trying to practice and exercise their own indigenous traditions and ceremonies and create a space for healing. And across the street, what they described were a group of hipsters dressed up in Day of the Dead makeup, just treating it like a cultural minstrel show, and really minimizing the sacred integrity and value that day holds for us. But the police didn't hem them up for being more than three in a group. So young people are being criminalized in many spaces. And in our fotonovela story, what they begin to do, and what we are currently and actively doing, is organizing. And the first part is just trying to raise awareness and education. When the injunctions were first kind of introduced, there were people who supported it because there's very real fear and concerns about safety and around crime issues. But what a lot of those, some of the abuelitos and some of the the señoras didn't know, police were talking about your baby. You know what I'm saying? No. You think there's this dichotomy. Oh, they're talking about some other bad kids, not my kid. No, they're talking about your kid, right? So, there's an expression that, we don't need police protection. We need protection from the police. And I cannot think of, I can't think of any. I'm not saying they don't exist, but I can't think of any particular example in which contacting law enforcement actually ended up benefiting the situation.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you to speak a little bit to the issue of restorative justice. You were saying, a lot of people just think of restorative justice as in a school setting, meaning either you're going to be suspended or you go through a circle and have some sort of restorative justice. But you've talked about it in a more expansive way here at this summit. What does restorative justice mean to you?
Well, for me, restorative justice is not an initiative or a neat new program or a curriculum. It's a way of life and a way of being with each other. And it's really about how we rebalance And rebalance is something that we have to do under many circumstances. It's a constant thing. But most certainly when there is a harm in our community, it's unbalancing. And rather than point the finger and try to shame, blame, and guilt someone, it's really about us collectively coming together in circle to figure out how we rebalance, how we create balance in the circle again. And so, this is very much rooted in my indigenous traditions, and it's been sort of appropriated by systems now in a way that I think is disingenuous sometimes.
What would we see in the schools if it was done in a more authentic and empowering kind of way?
Certainly. It's a challenge because a lot of the way I've been taught by my elders around how we hold circle is very culturally rooted and culturally specific. And so we have our songs, we have our ceremonies, and we have our rituals to bring us back into balance. And in a multiracial urban setting, given all the circumstances of modernity that we are kind of dealing with, right, in this society, we are coming from respective traditions, backgrounds, spiritual belief systems, and all, or religious backgrounds, and so on and so forth. So it becomes more challenging. It's not to say that you cannot do it. You can, but it becomes more challenging. And so I recognize and I acknowledge that. I think, to me, probably the best model or example that I'm familiar with of how it's been implemented in a school setting was actually done at Cole Middle School by a friend and colleague of mine named Rita Alfred, and at the time she was doing that for Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, our joy. And the interesting thing is that became the catalyst for the restorative justice sort of movement in Oakland schools. However, Cole Middle School is closed down. That model no longer exists. And everything that has happened since then has been cherry picking and just some elements which they pick and choose, elements of what they want to do. And there's been a lot of rhetoric and lip service around restorative justice. We've seen a New York Times write-up of Oakland Unified School District, and the school board has passed a resolution of this being a fully implemented restorative justice district over the course of 10 years, I believe about a year ago or something to that effect. So Oakland has gotten a lot of accolades that, frankly, I don't think are deserving. If we are, in fact, really going to be about restorative justice, then it has to, and what happened, I didn't really get an opportunity to share what was unique or what was valuable at Cole Middle School, is that Rita took time to train everyone on all levels. She started with the administrators and the teachers, the students, the parents. It was a cultural shift. Everyone has to be part of it. And you can't just have circle process when a harm occurs, when there's a fight between two students, and what it's also about, and this is where it becomes challenging, harm isn't just committed amongst students. There's teachers and administrators who commit harm too. They have to be subject to being, they have to agree to be a part of circle process too, right? And so it's really an equalizer in many ways around power dynamics. And so that can be very difficult, particularly when we think about the roots of education, public education, I should say, and its design and its purpose around, reinforcing systems of hierarchy and social stratification and power and control.
So how did that play out at Cole? I mean, if a student felt that they were being harmed by a
Sure.
teacher or administrator, what was their option?
So I can't, I think that would probably be an interview that you should do with Rita Alfred directly. But I would say that from philosophical or ideologically, when you begin to understand circle process, or even in a community, the way I train and teach is, if I have a problem with you, rather than hold that, and it might spill out in a way that, in different ways. It could be, microaggressions and passive-aggressive interactions, or it could just be like straight up after school, I'm gonna knock your head in, you know what I mean? Or we're gonna have to get it on because we can't get along type shit, right?
We're gonna edit this, don't worry about it.
Yeah, all right. So that said, in a traditional way, I now have a vehicle or way. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bring you an offering. The native way, I might offer you some tobacco. Say, hey, you know, I'd like to talk with you. Sit down. I'm gonna tell you in my heart and express, you know, what it was, and we're gonna sit and we're gonna talk, and I'm gonna share how I felt, and, you know, and we're gonna respond. And because I offered you that medicine, and because that medicine is sacred, you know, you're gonna honor, and we're gonna both speak from our heart. Now, in a school setting, it might look a little bit different. Okay, maybe a student or might bring to it, you know, let's just say it was an issue between a student and a teacher. They might take what their issue is, you know, to the restorative justice coordinator at the school and say, you know, the teacher said this in class today, and it really bothered me. You know, she said, I'm going to use an example of what my daughter brought to me recently about something that happened at her school. She said, you guys stop hanging out there, what are you guys, the such and such gang? And as a young person of color, being referred to as a gang, a very loaded term, you know, that carries stigma, you know, that really bothered my daughter. So in a school where there's a restorative justice model, she might, you know, bring that to the attention of the restorative justice coordinator so that she could then, because when she began to challenge the yard duty teacher who said that to her, she was threatened with suspension. But in a restorative justice school, they would sit down in circle, and they would each have a talking piece where they would have the opportunity to express themselves, to talk about how, you know, so she could express how that made her feel, why she didn't like it, the yard duty teacher, and there would be an opportunity to make amends, to heal it up, to develop some agreements, you know, so that there would be some transformative healing. You know, there's a lesson. There's a lesson that yard duty teacher can learn about stigmatizing language, you know, and not labeling students, right? And so, you know, when we think about a harm, it's really each harm that's committed, or every time, I shouldn't say committed, every time an incident of harm occurs, it's a learning opportunity. But Western society treats it as more of an opportunity to lock somebody up and blame and shame and all that, right?
Right. Thanks for that. Could you say a word about the increasing number of students who are coming from over the border, the ways that they've been criminalized, and perhaps how some of this is playing out for them in particular as their numbers are sort of rising in the schools and the mood of the country is getting more reactionary than it's been in the past?
Thank you for that question. In particular for our relatives who, because of their so-called legal status in this country, they are particularly vulnerable. You know, in general, as a society, we've become less willing to let mistakes that children make become opportunities for learning and growth and healing, and more about opportunities to lock up and punish and shame. And this is particularly true, and the threshold is even lower for young people who whose documentation in this country is questioned, for lack of a better term. I don't like to use the I word, if you know what I mean. So so what I will say is that too many young people I'm working with for behaviors that would be just considered a part of growth for any normal teenager, and some of the mistakes that they make are being criminalized and losing any hope or opportunity to ever become legal residents in this country. And then on top of that, there is even criminalization irregardless of whether or not there is any kind of behavior that's occurring under the guise of so many other things. And I'll give you an example is traffic stops, right? Sobriety checkpoints are generally targeted in Spanish-speaking Latino immigrant communities, where they know that many people are driving without a license because they're unable to obtain a license based on documentation. There's a bill that was recently signed, co-authored and sponsored by Assemblymember Alejo that's supposed to change that. There's still going to be some issues with it, though, because there's going to be a marker, an indicator on the license that's going to almost inform law enforcement that you're undocumented. So I have a legitimate license, but guess what? I'm undocumented. It says so right here on my license. So it's like, a little bit like Nazi Germany in some ways, but but it's supposed to be a step in the right direction, and so we're cautiously optimistic that it might help things improve. But in any case, those have nothing to do with sobriety checkpoints. Law enforcement knows it. Our community knows it. It's just a way of jamming and hemming people up. Police have contracts with tow companies. Tow companies impound those vehicles, and those families are never able to get those vehicles back. So there's a whole lot of people pimping and exploiting and profiting off the backs of very low-income, vulnerable immigrant families, and then it destabilizes them because they're driving without a license, so guess what? They get arrested. They're in Santa Rita jail. Dad gets deported. One less income earner in the family now, so the family's struggling more. So when we talk about trauma and how we are minimizing trauma and creating opportunities and spaces for healing to move beyond trauma, this really epitomizes examples of how law enforcement and systems are in fact perpetuating trauma, and how particularly those who are most vulnerable to trauma oftentimes have come from countries in which they've witnessed trauma, and those push and pull forces have brought them here, are being re-traumatized.
You use the term being a gangbanger for revolution. What would it look like to be a gangbanger for revolution within the educational system?
I think when we say banging for revolution, I think, I haven't invented that expression. I'm not really sure the origins of it, but I certainly understood the concept in terms of my own sort of healing journey and transition, which was that I was just coming from a place of anger and just ready to just like put in work. And many of us, who come from a background where we might have been affiliated with a street organization or a neighborhood, can kind of probably understand a little bit of some of that sentiment, where it was like, to be honest, it's probably not unlike college rivalries, only it gets a little more serious. Case in point, every year when I was a student at UC Berkeley, we had the big game against Stanford University, and you'd see fraternities, and they had their uniforms and their colors, blue and gold, burgundy and white, and there would be generally substance abuse taking place during the game and after the game, and oftentimes there were fights afterwards. Never saw anyone get criminalized at those games. So, we had kind of that sentiment, that kind of fire, that kind of passion for our neighborhood. And we put in work for our neighborhood, And my point is that in many ways, we also were coming from a place of anger that was unexplained. And I talk about this more around understanding historical intergenerational trauma, that because of legacies of colonialism, we have our own form of post-colonial stress disorder. And for us as indigenous people, it's a post-colonial stress, disorder, which is our form of PTSD. And in the African-American community, it can be referred to as a post-slave stress syndrome. And as a young man, I can recall, walking down the street and sometimes feeling intense, profound rage that was seemingly unexplained, and other times intense and profound sadness that was seemingly unexplained. And, genetic scientists refer to that as gene memory. But in our indigenous science, we've always known that this existed, and we called it our ancestral, and we called it our bone memory. And so that anger is sometimes what also motivated us, and maybe why things get more serious in terms of some of these neighborhood rivalries. But we really didn't have a cause. In many ways, we're rebelling against the system we perceive to be inherently adverse to us. But we're doing it in a way that's fratricidal. We have no political objective. So imagine when you all of a sudden begin to, learn your own history and liberate your mind. When that occurred for me, when I found my way into community college campus and started to, take ethnic studies classes and read certain books, I felt profound rage, legitimate rage. why wasn't I never ever taught this? Why am I only now getting the vocabulary to describe what I've been feeling and living all of my childhood? And how many of my friends would maybe not be incarcerated or not dead if if this had been shared with us when we were young? And so the same way I put in work for my neighborhood with that, I fought, and I had no political objective. Well, shit, all of a sudden now I have a political objective, a very righteous one, And I think when we think about some of the radical social movements, particularly the militant ones, of the 60s and 70s, and we think about, the Black Liberation Army and Brown Berets, American Indian Movement, the Weather Underground, and many others. I think that's, in some ways were manifestations of that, right? People banging for revolution. The problem in my belief system is that, in our effort to dismantle that, we are, in our effort to fight oppression, in some ways we're reproducing it just by that energy, that spirit, because it's coming from a place of anger and a place of rage, which is, to me, that's the energy of the oppressor. And, Che Guevara said, that the true revolution is guided by a great feeling of love. And one of my elders, when I began to become active in the movement, said, we don't struggle and fight for the hate of our enemy, but for the love of our people. And so that spiritual intervention was very critical in my development, because I began to heal so that I'm still a fighter, but that rage, that anger, it will consume you. It's like a cancer in your body. And when you begin to think about all of the issues, even in the movement circles, that began to self-implode, we saw it. And from some of your more savvy listeners who might have been part of those movements or are well-versed in those movements, we began to take some of our own people out. Certainly COINTELPRO created a lot of that distrust, but how much of that was also our own baggage and trauma that we had never resolved, that we brought into the movement and the struggle, so that 80% of our energy we are now fighting amongst ourselves instead of directing it against oppression to make change. And we became so fixated in trying to destroy the system that we didn't learn how to create and build. And there's things that we can create and build, and we don't need anyone's permission. We don't even have to be a part of the system to do. How we create, how we learn our songs, our traditional languages, our dances, our ceremonies, our rituals, and reclaim that. How we reconnect to the land and the earth. All of those sacred things, those are all cathartic. Those are all a part of our healing, our heart, a part of us becoming human, And so that has to be a critical part of fundamental and revolutionary change, in my view. So I think there's definitely elements, like they say, where I come from, and I think every neighborhood probably has some expression in some way, shape, or form, that you can take the homie out the hood, but you can't take the hood out the homie, right? There's always going to be a part of that in me, but going back to the teachings of restorative justice, it's about balance. And so having ceremony and having a spiritual path, to be able to take time to feed my spirit, to heal, to grow, to consume myself in love as much as possible, to stand up in defense of my family and children and my community from a place of love, is what I attempt to do to the best of my ability.
We're here at a summit with a lot of educators. Anything else you would say to educators about what it would mean to really break with the kinds of legacies you're talking about, and to really break the school to prison pipeline? Like, what would they have to step up to and really do differently?
I think we have to rethink how we deal with behavior in the context of schools. And, a lot of teachers, because I've done training for several school districts. I've trained Salinas, Vallejo, Coachella Valley. And what I'll often share, because teachers will ask, is, well, I don't know how I can do this with everything else, all the other things that I'm asked to do as a teacher. And we do, we continuously put more and more strain and burdens and pressure on our teachers and other staff who are well-intentioned and who care for our students and are doing the best that they're able to. How can I do this too? How can I, this seems like this is something really intense, really in depth, that requires time and energy that I don't know if I have that. And what I'll share is, restorative justice isn't just when a harm occurs. It's a way of life and a way of being with each other, which means that it's basic concepts. In Spanish, we say conocimiento, acknowledgement. At the very beginning of the week, having each of your students come in and circle and acknowledge each other, shake hands, and just share one highlight from their weekend, one thing that they're looking forward to. If you're really running out of time in terms of classroom management, one word, one word of affirmation. There's many ways to kind of check in and do that. And when it is deserving, then sometimes it requires a little more time and attention. But we're quick to suspend a student for 3 to 5 days and not have them come back to school. But we couldn't take 3 hours to address the root cause of whatever it was. And those are ADA dollars. If you just want to think in capitalist terms that only values money before we value people, and you want to just think about it in basic economic terms, the school should have a vested interest for all those who think in that distorted way and say, well, yeah, this would be a lot more cost efficient for me to keep the student in school and resolve the conflict within the context of school, instead of calling the police and having the student hauled off to juvenile hall, and then I may not have the student come back to the school ever, or at least not for maybe a couple weeks or a few months, or whatever the case may be, or suspend them for 3 to 5 days, and all the ADA dollars, you're going to miss out on that. My point is that restorative justice can happen in very basic ways. It can be a check-in, it can be a positive word of affirmation, and that it's also the way you teach. For any educators who are familiar with Paulo Freire, Brazilian education philosopher and author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The irony of Pedagogy of the Oppressed is that it was written in this very academic language, but all Paulo Freire did, and we unfortunately reproduce this through the academic industrial complex, Paulo Freire became the expert on this. This wasn't his teaching philosophy. This was the teaching philosophy of indigenous and African communities that he observed in Brazil, which was using circle process and recognizing the value that each of us is a teacher and each of us is a student. So as an educator, remember that you're always a student, because if you think otherwise and you're ripe, there ain't nothing left for you to do but rot. But as long as you're green, you're always growing.
Anything else you want to add?
I think that's it.
Okay, good.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Right on.
Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
All right.